Are we ready to go? Okay. Hello and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmad. I am the founding director of Sweatshop Literacy Movement. I'm the author of The Lebs, and most recently, I am the very proud editor of this amazing new anthology called After Australia. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations program run by the City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions throughout the event and we'll be able to answer some of these towards the end of the event. Please submit your questions in the YouTube chat or over email via conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. You can also subscribe to this Knowledge Melbourne YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. First, I want to do an acknowledgement to country. And considering the fact that we are celebrating the release of the new anthology After Australia, I would like to take the opportunity to read the acknowledgement featured on the first page of our publication. We acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we work and on which this book was produced, and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. We recognize that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. We embrace the principle of First Nations first, recentering Australian history with indigenous histories. We recognize that Australia's migration history began and continues on stolen land that has not been ceded, and that it is untenable to talk about race in Australia without situating it in the histories of dispossession and colonization of Australia's First Peoples. Today, we are joined by three of the contributors to After Australia. First, my sister, Hannah Donnelly, who is so many things, a writer, a community arts worker, curator, an artist, a DJ, and who wrote the 4 sections of After Australia: the interlude, the prologue, and the epilogue. Hannah, hi, how are you?
Hi, yeah, good, thank you. A bit tired, but good.
Well, we'll let you take a quick break after we've done the introduction and focus on the other 2 panelists. But first, do you want to tell us where you are, what land you're on, and how you're doing?
Thank you. So I am sitting here on the beautiful country of the Darug peoples in Parramatta, close by to the Parramatta River of the Barramuttagal peoples. And I feel very honored to be able to sit in this space so close to such a beautiful story of river where salt water and freshwater meet. I am feeling a little bit exhausted today, so I will give a disclaimer. I've been doing curatorial intensives every day via Zoom for the last couple of days, working on the 23rd Biennale of Sydney for 2022, and I've just jumped off that other Zoom meeting to come into this Zoom meeting. So thank you for having me.
We're so honored to have you, and you know, when you're ready and you've gathered your thoughts, we'll bring you into the conversation. The second panelist that we're talking to today, who's another contributor to After Australia, is the amazing Michelle Law. Michelle, like Hannah, is many things: a writer, short story writer, an essayist, a playwright, a screenwriter, a performer. Hi, Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm really excited to be part of the panel and be speaking with all of you about this book that I'm really honored and excited to be a part of and talk about some of its themes with you all.
Thank you. And what land are you on at the moment?
I'm currently in the Eora Nation of the Gadigal peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. I feel very lucky to be living and working on this land as a settler and be able to share these stories and this event with you all.
Thank you, Michelle. And our third panelist today is my brother, Khalid Hosseini. Khalid is a short story writer, an essayist, a cultural critic, a literary critic. He is a community arts worker. And I want to say, hey, Khalid, how are you? Tell us how you're doing, and also tell us where you're meeting us, where you're joining us from today.
Thanks so much for that very generous introduction. I'm so glad to be here. I live in Wiradjuri country, but it's live on the close to the Maribyrnong River, which is a site that's also important to the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. And I just also want to echo the acknowledgement that you began our conversation with Mohammed, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. So we are in for a really special chat today because I like to think of us as the 5 A's of identity in Australia. Australia, we are Australians, but we have Aboriginal, African, Arab, and Asian heritage, bringing us, unifying us today for this conversation. And so the backstory to this quickly is that 2 years ago, I was approached by Lena Nahlus from Diversity Arts Australia, who originally conceived the idea for this project, to be the editor and to bring together writers, 12 writers from every state in Australia, from indigenous backgrounds and CALD backgrounds, to write stories that speculate, that imagine what Australia might look like by the year 2050. And what we came up with was this anthology called After Australia. And so today I want to talk to you all about the anthology as a whole, how it's been publicly received, and then also about your individual works and stories. I want to start by talking to Michelle. And the reason is, I feel like before we talk about the book itself and the specific stories, it's incredibly important that we talk about the kind of socio-political context that we're emerging from. And you, in many ways, have been at the forefront of debates and discussions about race in Australia. And what I find, just kind of looking at your experiences this year, is how difficult it is for Australians, white Australia, and also quite a few members from minorities, to talk about race. And so I wanted to ask you, where do you think we are as a nation right now? And also, why do you think it's so hard for Australia and Australians to talk about race and racism?
I just want to apologise in advance if there's a bit of, to whoever's watching, there's a lot of construction noise going on outside this building. So I'm sorry if that bleeds in, and I'll repeat things if they're not caught on audio. I think we're definitely at a tipping point, I think globally, when it comes to discussions of race and everything that's going on socio-politically. I don't, there's all those memes going around at the moment that are like, it's not the year, it's anti-blackness, it's about class, and it's about, issues that don't exist within this very constrained time frame, things that have been going on for decades and decades that we haven't actually addressed. I think in Australia particularly, we have real trouble talking about race in any way because we haven't actually acknowledged the dispossession of land from First Nations people. We find that conversation already really awkward, and so we sweep all of this under the carpet. And so, in any context, in any field when issues of race come up, it's very much like, Australia is not a racist country, and we're doing so much better than other countries and other Western nations. But at the same time, what's scary about racism in Australia is that it is quite insidious, and that we tell ourselves that it is getting better. But when you talk to any minority person who's living with daily microaggressions and having these, being gaslit when it comes to racially charged experiences that they have, I think there's, not to completely write off all the progress that we have made, but there's still a fair way to go. And I think that's why we're having conversations like this and why this book exists.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Khaled, I'll pick up on that, those points that Michelle made. I want to ask you a similar question, but I want to ask you it specifically within the context of Black Lives Matter. You know, you're an Afro-diasporic writer. What do you think is where we are as a nation right now? And I want to ask you also, why do you think conversations about race and racism and white supremacy in Australia are so difficult? And do you think they're uniquely difficult, or do you think it's just part of the global phenomenon that we're dealing with right now?
Well, I like to think of the way Australia deals with race, or has conversations about race, as not unique, as existing within a larger, transnational global networks of, white supremacist capitalist patriarchies, and also, societies that are set up to not really have the best interests of the vulnerable and marginalized people at heart. I like to think of it in those broader senses, but then I often come across things that are so uniquely Australian and so atrocious. And I'm like, well, there's clearly something going on in Australia specifically. But we'd be lying to ourselves if we say that, if one of Australia's most potent mediocrities as a nation is in the way it deals with any issue of any sensitivity at all, as a society and politically. And I think we shouldn't really lose sight on thinking of ourselves as exceptional in that way. But I think there are links of solidarity to draw internationally that I think are worth exploring, particularly within context of Black Lives Matter and other similar related struggles. I know there's a lot of fruitful conversations, discussions that happens within indigenous communities across America and Canada and Australia. And I like to situate myself within that conversation, sorry, not within that specific conversation, but in the sense of the Black Lives Matter conversation. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I feel like, it's a vibe that we coincide with, but there's complexities and nuances here that, can make it seem situationally different. But there are larger, broader conversations that run as a through line through all of these struggles and liberation struggles.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Khaled. So, for both Michelle and Khaled, since the book's come out after Australia, it's been tremendously successful. We've sold a couple of thousand copies. It's been critically acclaimed, heaps of terrific reviews. It's a very talked about book. I think that's got a lot to do with the time that it was released. It's a very timely book. But as you both know, it's also been steeped in controversy. Look at the cover, you've got these white faces that are scribbled out. We've been getting, me and our organizations and some of our authors have been getting letters from very angry white Australian citizens. We've been receiving death threats. We've been receiving, we've been getting a lot of trolls on Twitter. I mean, can you tell me both what you feel the reception has been to the book so far, and how you're coping with it, how you're feeling about it, both the positive and the negative aspects?
Sorry, okay. I feel like starting on a more positive note, it has been really exciting seeing it be so successful and sell so many copies, and be getting really amazing feedback from readers who, often cite a lot of their favorite authors being within the anthology, which is great to hear. But I guess the negative aspects of it, a lot of it has been to do with, the visual of the book cover and what exactly are you imagining as the future of Australia. And people feeling quite threatened that the status quo is being questioned in our pieces and in the artwork for the book. So that has been a little bit unsettling, but, I guess as a minority person in this country and someone who works in quite a public field, not something that any of us, I think, are quite, it's not very foreign to us. At the same time, those things don't make you feel nice. It is a book that is speculative fiction. So I think that it's important that the book itself exists because, you know, we're here to provoke questions and provoke thinking. So, yeah, it's been a very interesting time.
Khalid, what do you think?
Honestly, like in terms of the larger reception to the book, I've chosen to, you know, like focus exclusively on the positive and the fruitful interactions that I have around the book. A lot of the time, there has been, as Michelle alluded to, there's been conversations around this book that were quite dumb and racist. And, you know, although I haven't in this specific context of this book, haven't dealt with that directly. There was a situation as in like Omar's story, which was, I think you can speak to it a little bit more, Mohammed, later. But also it's been really, like, apart from that, it's been really heartening. And I've been really, obviously, I'm so incredibly honored to be alongside some of my favorite writers, and the caliber of the writing and the work is really getting acknowledged, is being seen. And I think this book has been the site of a lot of fruitful conversations, both for me personally, and things that I've witnessed online of people having conversations and sharing the book. So I'm glad to be a small part of that. And that's the thing that, you know, it's a really great.
Yeah, great. So I want to build on what you just alluded to, which is the discussion about Omar and his work. And I'll ask you, Khalid, and Michelle, this last question before I bring Hannah into the discussion as well. But so to give some background to anybody that's joining us, you know, all three of you you've got your fans in the book. You know, you've all been singled out several times in different reviews and you know, among, you know, social media discussion about the book. By far, one of the most talked about and controversial stories in the anthology is our brothers, Omar Sakers, who's an Arab Australian Muslim poet originally from the western suburbs of Sydney. And the story White Flu is about, loosely, I think if Omar was here, he would speak about it more eloquently, but it's about a flu that seems to be wiping out people who would be identified as white disproportionately. And it's a subversive work because, of course, when we think of things like COVID-19, they disproportionately wipe out people of color and indigenous people. And there has been a lot of, you know, white tears, to use a term that, you know, famously referring to a book by Ruby Hamad called White Tears, Brown Scars. There's been a lot of white tears around Omar's story. Now, I think the particular incident that Khalid's referring to, which I think I would like both your opinions on, is when Omar recently was asked to write a piece, like a kind of a piece that was advertising and celebrating the release of the book. And it was meant to be published, but it was cancelled. The people, I won't name names, but the people who were going to publish it made the decision not to publish it because they were very concerned that Omar in the story had a scene where dogs were being whipped, and they felt like this was promoting cruelty towards animals. The painful irony for us, of course, is that the story had references and mention and, you know, critiquing and discussing things like the Christchurch massacre. And time again for us as people of color and indigenous people, we're reminded both, and I say this rhetorically and very literally, we're reminded that sometimes it feels like white Australia actually cares about the rights of dogs and animals more than it cares about our rights as human beings. And Khalid, I'll start with you when I ask this question, because in your story in After Australia, you actually do explore quite vividly that very strange, intimate relationship between dogs and Australians. And you also, you know, that's in the foreground of the story. And in the background is this kind of really subtle, frightening racial tension where, you know, refugees are disappearing in the middle of the night. And so I wondered, through that lens, if you had any insights into this particular issue that our brother and fellow writer Omar Sakers has been dealing with in the last week.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because yeah, my story is about two best friends, and they have one of them has a dog who's sick, and they're trying to sort out. They're usually trying to like take the dog to a vet and going through all of that. But in the background, there's always other stuff that's happening in the story. The thing is that since the story was published, I've had a couple of media interviews and like had a couple of events around the story, and I spent far more time talking about the dog and the friends and the dogs than I thought I would, because the story really isn't about that. So it's really, as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, Mohammed's onto something here, because I totally know what he's talking about.
What is it? What is going on there?
I don't know. As like in the specific of like are we
Well, let me ask you it this way, and then I'll ask Michelle what she thinks. But why do you think, in terms of the way the public reception to your story and the discussions you've been having are more centered around the dog than, you know, a person of color disappearing in the middle of the night because of because of like the nation state?
Well, like honestly, like we could. There's a lot of things, but I think one of the main reasons, one of the main causes, I think, and this is something that's kind of endemic amongst a reading public who really can't see beyond their own prejudices and biases, is that it just kind of makes you a bad reader. And for someone to read Omar's story and concentrate on the dog aspect, on the animals being whipped, when we know for a fact that in fiction, often there's so much more going on than the explicit or the specific thing that's happening, and the context in which something happens is so separated from the thing itself. And to be unable to separate those two and simultaneously contextualize it within the larger conversation that the story is having, but much more immediate things that impact real people's lives. I think it's sad because what really is someone not being able to meet the imaginative capacity of the work at where the work is, and it's a real failure of reading, and that's not something that's great. I don't like, as you know, even in a smaller sense, when I'd be on, talking to somebody about this story that I wrote, and I spend 25 minutes talking about a dog, but what I'm really talking about is white supremacy, and the story is really about racism and white supremacy, and I'm talking about two best friends dealing with a dog for 25 minutes. I mean, as a writer, I love talking about my work, don't get me wrong, but I also, it's kind of interesting where I'm kind of thinking, well, where is this my fault, this miscommunication? That is there something going on where I'm missing something? But also, I recognize failures of reading in myself sometimes, and I know that it's kind of a tragedy, because it's a less full life in terms of your engagement with things.
Michelle.
It's interesting you say that, Khalid, because I think, it's a less full life because it means that you're lacking that level of empathy, I think. Because I think what happens a lot is that we often find ourselves relating and projecting our feelings onto animals. And we dehumanize and we become desensitized to the struggles of Indigenous peoples and Black people and people of color. And so, in a way, when you see groups of culled people, it's like they become faceless individuals to a lot of people. And, and it sounds harsh, but they often are treated less than human, or, less than even a dog. And, I think all of us have probably had that experience in our lives and probably continue to have that at some points.
Well, like the main thing, like there's a famous lynching photo where a white man is next to his daughter, and she's smiling proudly, and next to them is a Black man who's been hung. And this young girl, she must be 8 or 9. She's not registering the situation on how it really is. She's smiling at the camera. And I can't remember which writer it was, but I remember reading about where a writer just pointed out that one of the functions of racism is that it dehumanizes someone to the extent where they literally become less than a dog. And the writer made that link between the dog and the little girl's empathy for the black man who's a corpse next to her, who's dead. Where the writer pointed out that, you know, almost certainly that little girl would be traumatized, so sad at the thought of her pet dog dying. But here she is standing next to a dead black man next to her mother, and they're both smiling into the camera. And that is, Michelle, what you said, that's literally, I think the reason why, Mohammed, I think it's so important that you're talking about this is because those small little things make clear what, you know, taken larger are in their orders of magnitude, you know, different from the example that I just gave, but they exist on the same continuum of dehumanization and inability to extend empathy and understanding. And you know, maybe I'm being a bit too, maybe like I think it's a real tragedy, but it's also wrong, and it's also hurts people of color a lot. But I also want to point out how much of a tragedy it is for there to be people who are going around not really extending empathy towards other people. Their lives are missing a vital goodness in it. And I don't know, I just get really upset when I think about that, because I think about all the joy and love in the world that's being lost that's lost to us because of the inability of people to extend empathy towards others.
Michelle, do you want to weigh in again before Hannah jumps in?
Yeah, well, I just mean on that note, you know, it's a really good point, because systemic racism really serves no one. I mean, in the same way that the patriarchy serves no one, because it means that, you know, white people are missing out on being part of the world. You know, they really are the outsiders looking in. And, you know, you talk about how racism affects negatively minority peoples, but it's actually the disconnection that a lot of white people have from communities and color that's happening around them. I mean, that's, I think, pretty tragic. And it's why they feel compelled to misappropriate and take from other cultures, because it's like, what else do you have?
Hannah, are you ready to join us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for letting me observe and get my brain in the space.
You're welcome, but I've been so excited to bring you into the conversation. So what I'll say is that I think a big framing of this conversation, and I did intend that this would be a large and significant aspect of our conversation, is talking about the public reception to After Australia, and specifically the white fragility that has been kind of surrounding the book. And I will tell the audience that you have a collection in the anthology, and you were also a sub-editor, you know, and I learned a lot from working with you as somebody who was mentoring me in speculative fiction. Your series is called Black Thoughts, and it basically creates the arc of the entire book so that you could read it. What I wanted as the editor was for somebody to read it from cover to cover and kind of go through an experience for the book as a whole. Now, I want to tell you about an incident, and then I want you to speak to it. But when I was doing one of the early interviews for the book, I'm pretty sure it was with Radio National. It was with ABC Sydney Radio. And I was asked about the opening paragraph of your section, your collection. And that's also the opening paragraph to the book. So I want to read it to the audience, and then I want to tell you what the white interviewer asked me about your story, and then maybe you can speak to it. So this is the first section of Black Thoughts. It's called Unreconciliatory Futures. And that first paragraph is, I'm going to educate you, Gronks. I get pissed off when white people wear the Aboriginal flag. Hey, you, yeah, I'm talking to you. At protests, at exhibition openings, in selfies on Invasion Day, or because you lived in the Northern Territory for 5 years. Now, the interviewer on the radio read out that paragraph and then said to me, don't you think that is offensive? Don't you think that is alienating? And what are we as white people supposed to do if we can't wear the flag? How else are we supposed to show support? So I wanted to ask you about the fragility that's been kind of coming at you in response to your work. And I want to actually give you the opportunity to maybe even try to answer the question, what are you expecting from white people, if not for them to wear the flag?
Thank you. The part where what I'm really talking about, why do you want to put the flag on your body? When do you want to put the flag on your body? And like how much of that is part of other actions that you take. And of course, now when I wrote this was before a lot of kind of solidarity and ally kind of critical thinking around the Black Lives Matter movements and going beyond virtue signaling and some of the really good critical conversations that have been had this year were happening before I was writing this before some of that conversation was happening more mainstream. So, well, it's a bit of a story. Okay, so there is a particular person that I'm talking about in that opening, somebody that liked to wear the Aboriginal flag for the opening of a white person, a white artist that would like to wear the Aboriginal flag in performances or art, the launch of their exhibition or something. I didn't really like. I just find. Of course, also I have to say that in the context of this conversation, there's also a lot happening around the Aboriginal flag right now, and the rights to the flag. And I would just like to put a little asterisk against anybody that has questions about that to have a read. Claire Coleman, who is of course in this anthology, has written a really good piece called "The Flag is Art, Art is Copyright" in The Engine very recently, around what's happening with the flag and rights to the flag. So, which has so many different layers that if I went into that part of the conversation, I guess all I would say is that I support Black business and I support artists to have their own copyright. And there is a conflict in this kind of particular story of the Aboriginal flag right now. So I think there's an endemic problem of virtue signaling, of posting, of having the right photo for Instagram, that I'm kind of calling out, rather than actually saying like, don't ever have anything to do with the Aboriginal flag. Of course, I'm not saying that. I think it's like, if you want to truly do anything, there is a process of critically unpacking your own histories, and there's some cognitive dissonance involved in that. And until you've gone through that, like, I don't really actually know what the point of you wearing the Aboriginal flag is as a white settler.
Why do you think some of your readers are so offended? Why do you think they're so confronted and challenged by you offering to educate them, Gronks?
Well, I think there's many layers to it. There always is, but I think under particular governments, probably particularly the Howard government, there was a national consciousness or story around reconciliation, in which reconciliation is one very important aspect of a whole journey that people should go on. But the way that this was promoted, it was in contrast to the Mabo decision, where there had been this historical kind of recognition of overturning terra nullius, and then where, you know, the movement around land rights and the conversations that led to eventually, well, the native title legislation that is pretty flawed in the way that Aboriginal people have to prove a continuous connection to country to the High Court. The reconciliation movement, in the sense of Howard's the Howard government era's essence of the reconciliation movement, was two parties kind of coming together, Aboriginal Australia and everybody else in Australia, and kind of, you know, the gesturing of outstretched hands towards each other. But that is a very basic and flawed understanding of reconciliation, and who needs to who from the Aboriginal community needs to reconcile? Like, what have we done to settlers in white Australia that we need to be reconciling with them for? Because it's just ridiculous. The work needs to be done on one side. Like, there's not an equal level of work that needs to be done there. So particularly in that kind of framework, I mean, there are many different forms of truth and reconciliation in different countries around the world, like how they've gone through processes of truth and reconciliation, and some of them have been like truth and reconciliation commissions. And I think we have, Australia chose the lightest, most aesthetically pleasing road of reconciliation that had not much constructive kind of critique of the settlement and occupation and continuing occupation of this country.
Yeah, I mean, I totally hear your point on reconciliation. One of the kind of terms that I grew up with, you know, as an Australian is the Aboriginal problem. And it took me a very long time to understand that Aboriginals are not our problem, we're your problem. And so, look, it's been an incredibly, this has been an incredibly powerful conversation so far. I'm going to read just a kind of little update for anybody that's joined us recently. And then I want to move on to talking about the writing itself. But I just need to say that if you've just joined us, my name is Mohammed, and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, Imagining Other Realities, as part of the Melbourne Conversations program run by the City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions throughout the event, and we'll be able to answer some of these towards the end of the event. Please submit your questions in the YouTube chat or over email via conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. You can also subscribe to this Knowledge Melbourne YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. So,
Mohammed,
yes.
Sorry to interject here before you read the next thing. I was thinking about the situation with animal cruelty, and I just happened to have a few things to maybe propose to talk about at some point.
Let's do it now. I finished what I had to read.
Oh,
yeah.
So that's all you had to do.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Jump in now. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think when people talk about animal cruelty in a certain context, what are you? In this context, is this not a conversation around citizenship and who are real citizens of this nation state? And like who, because on the other scale of this conversation around who has the right to publish whatever they want in terms of the freedom of speech and freedom of imagination, and especially the racial imaginary, would not if it was the case that it was a white person writing from the perspective of the racial imaginary, perhaps the idea that is as bad as animal cruelty probably wouldn't have stopped a piece being published. So I just had those thoughts.
Yeah, it's when the objection's being made, it's always like, hey, come on, like now we're having this conversation about animal cruelty. Is that what we're doing?
I want to ask you, Hannah, why do you think this is the case? What is it about this country that creates that kind of dynamic with Indigenous people and people of color?
Well, I think the fiction of the existence of the nation state, probably, from my perspective, of course, that from the beginning this wasn't a violent occupation. That while some, well, of course, more recently, I guess, as the different Australian communities and the different wonderful communities that make up Australia have had more of a consciousness around Black history and Aboriginal Australian history is what I mean by that. And what would be like the real history. And I think, I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing. I actually don't know. But I think if you think about, I think earlier, both perhaps Michelle and Khalid both touched on the idea that the first kind of sin against Aboriginal people has then been repeated and revisited against all peoples of color, POCs in this country at different stages through like literally the White Australia policy, or then other kind of other ways that narratives have positioned people as like lesser or not really Australian or whatever.
Thank you, Hannah. This is such a big and powerful conversation, and I'm hoping that our audience is stimulated by it, and we'll have some follow-up questions so we can continue the discussion in the last, say, 25 minutes of our dialogue. I still want to focus on these discussions about race and white supremacy and white fragility, but I want to focus it in a little bit now on your stories and on the craft of creative writing, because first and foremost, I think we need to, we always feel like we're being pigeonholed as minorities first and then writers second, but our craft is the skill of writing and storytelling. And so I want to give you all the respect to talk about your craft. I'll start with Michelle. Michelle, in your story, I would say yours is one of the most like to the kind of literal theme of thinking about the year 2050. And, it is a very dystopian future. And so many people who have read your story and have discussed it with me or written about it, talk about the sadness and the despair that you detail in this incredibly vivid imaginary world. I, as the editor, I remember having quite emotional conversations with you about the story. I found it a story of hope. I found it very moving. And, we had a discussion about moving your original ending and making it a prologue to your piece. And because I really think the last line, where the last line is now, every time I read it, I get incredibly emotional. And I think it will bring a lot of people to tears, but in a very hopeful way and in a very spiritual way. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think your story and your work is meant to be a commentary on the despair of where we're headed, or is it for you a story of hope?
I think it's simultaneously both. And I think as a writer, I try to strike that really difficult balance. I attempt to strike that balance of pathos as well as, optimism and hope. For me, it's a little bit of both. I think she's coming from a pretty desperate situation. So for audience members who might be watching who haven't read it, it's set in Sydney in 2050. And I actually, we started working on these pieces a couple of years ago now. And it was quite eerie because we were going through the final edits around when the bushfires were happening in sort of December, January. And I remember feeling quite freaked out because I was like, oh my God, I've predicted what's going to happen. And so, this story set in a world that is post pandemic and post climate disaster. And, Australia is being inundated by climate refugees. And now there's a cap on the population. And so the protagonist, who's a young teenage girl, finds herself pregnant and essentially has to leave her country and seek refuge elsewhere because she's living here illegally as a pregnant woman. So for me, it's simultaneously a story of warning, but one of, perpetual, I think in a way I'm a lot of I'm an idealist. I think if I wasn't, I wouldn't be able to continue making the work that I do, because you just get, the amount of rejection and the amount of abuse you can cop when you do this sort of work is pretty, it's taxing. So ultimately, I see there being something exciting in her future for this protagonist. But, that also comes with having to make a lot of sacrifices and sadness too. But, that's life.
Let me take the opportunity to ask you one more question. You talk about how we were all kind of working on these stories, and we were making this book before the bushfires, before COVID, before the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, it's kind of frightening to think that we were predicting 2050 and it's happening in 2020. Most of the stuff that you all wrote about. I mean, I think that is definitely one of the reasons why the book has resonated, because it's been such a strong and powerful message for where we're headed. What do you think the implications of you and the other writers predicting the future and producing this timely book are? What is the message, and what does this mean for our future as a nation?
I would hope some of the pieces act as a word of warning, as in this is a route that we don't want to take. It feels odd now, watching dystopian fictions, whether it's reading it or watching it on TV, because it just feels like the present. So I think, I think the implication is to really truly interrogate yourself as an individual and the life that you're leading, and how that affects the world on a macro level and how it affects others on a micro level, is what I hope.
Thank you, Michelle. Khaled, I want to ask you, of all the stories in the book, I think yours would come off as the most mundane. It feels the most, for anyone who reads it, it would feel the most ordinary, and it would feel the most real, as in set in a kind of very obvious present, and everything seems very calm and still. And what I love about your story, as somebody who had the honor of working on it with you for a year, is the way in which all the tension and all the fear and all the kind of hysteria, all the drama, all the kind of underlying horror is really subtle, and it's kind of it's a background to a very ordinary world. For you as a storyteller and as a writer, why did you make this, why did you choose to tell it this way? Why didn't you just kind of go in the same direction as Michelle, of just kind of giving a literal or fictional dystopian future set in 2050?
Well, I could be like, my first response was, well, I tried to write a story like Michelle's, didn't quite work. But like I've been interested in doing the, figuring out how much weight to give to themes in stories, because as a writer I have all these concerns, and I come into stories wanting to do certain things, and like I tried to write a version of this story where the plot and the drama and the stuff that is backgrounded in the story is actually is brought more to the foreground. And the thing that I learned was that the story just had no credibility like that, because I was writing at the time of the bushfire crisis, well, an ongoing crisis of bushfires, and there was like the air was thick with smog every day, and living in this weird situation where like our whole country was on fire. And but it was not so much learning anything new about what was happening in the world or about the crisis that we're dealing with. It's more having a crisis be confirmed to us beyond like any sense of that usual distance that we can provide, that we can apply between ourselves and tragedies like that. And I found that when I wrote a version of the story where the more dramatic, high stakes, slightly absurdist elements of the plot were foregrounded, what I found was that, it didn't really have credibility, because it didn't reflect the way I was moving through the world myself, as someone who was dealing with a less fantastical nature of less fantastic of apocalypse, but no less like absurd. And I found that a lot of the conversation thinking that I was having around that was more about this tension that you sit with between the thing in your life, that all the stress that you're experiencing and or a lot of the stress that you're experiencing in your day-to-day life is pointed at or against that this big cluster of problems. And these includes, you know, like I'd say the main one is like, you know, capitalism and all its attendant miseries. And but then again, I'm actually living a life. I'm, you know, hanging out with my friends, going to cafes, I'm going to work, I'm doing all these normal, and it seems so obvious to say that life does go on like that, and we have this mundane in between the heightened moments of drama. But I think as a storyteller, it took me a while to realize that. As a writer, it took me a while to realize that with this story, because I think there's a lot more interesting, like the conversation about the story is, I think, a lot more interesting if it's a light touch and backgrounded instead of made to be this big foreground. And of course, that also invites, you know, a certain misreading of the story. But that was also another aspect where I kind of wanted to write a very normal story, but also had, you know, a lot of absurd stuff in it.
One of the kind of what I would argue are silly criticisms of the book is that not all the stories are some kind of, you know, Star Wars type futuristic, you know, technologically advanced world. I think that's an ignorant understanding of what speculative fiction is. And I'm hoping Hannah and I are going to delve into that in a moment. But I just want to ask you one more question, Khaled. I mean, what I'm very proud of with the book as an editor is the way the pieces speak to our past, present, and future as a whole. The way your story and Michelle's, for example, are different, and how they say something together that isn't the same thing. They are contributing to a body of work as a single entity. One, I think, of the most important aspects of this book is there are two black male writers in After Australia, yourself and our brother Future D Fidel, who's originally from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Future writes a story which, again, was incredibly eerie and timely. It, you know, it was about him wandering a street in Brisbane and being harassed by police just for being black. And of course, you know, black men have been at the center of the debates around the world around Black Lives Matter. Black men are the ones who are being killed by police in the last a bunch of incidents that have made global news. What do you think the role of literature plays in empowering and supporting black men during this particular moment in time?
Yeah, I understand. I think I understand the full scope of your question, but I'd also like to make a quick clarification on the point about the murders of black men. There's also a lot of black women and black trans people being murdered and non-binary people murdered, but we just don't hear about it as often. So there's also that, and like it seems an obvious thing a point to make, but it's worth making whenever we have these conversations. But yeah, there is a lot of, I don't know, it's a complicated question, because it's a question that is such an ongoing knot in my life. Like it's just a thing that I'm dealing with all the time. And I have this, you know, instinctual drive towards ambivalence whenever it comes to conversations about this, because I know that I know that like it's hard to exist in opposition to something. It's hard to live your life in a way that makes sense when you're opposing something all the time. And a lot of my, you know, especially when it comes to black masculinity, there's a lot to put yourself up against. There's a lot that's working against you that you have to work against. And I'm not as interested in having those conversations, because they're more depleting than I'm comfortable having in my day-to-day life. Instead, you know, I like to, I don't know where I'm getting at, but the framing of that question is one that I find incredibly difficult to answer. I don't know if I can attempt to answer it, but I can find a way to, you know, talk around it, I guess, or talk I don't know. I think I'm trading off here.
Do you have anything to add? You said you think you can find a way to talk around it.
I will. I think I'll think of something.
Okay. Well, I'll go. I want to take the conversation to Hannah now. Hannah, you were kind of my mentor on the project as an expert in speculative fiction. And so just to start, I want to talk to you for about 10 minutes before we open it up to to questions from the audience. But the first part of the conversation I want to have with you about your writing is, what do you think is the difference between what we call speculative fiction as a genre and what we call science fiction? And why do you think people mix up those two forms?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for calling me an expert, but I definitely don't think of myself as an expert in speculative fiction. Just, but my practice kind of definitely focusing on indigenous futurisms. I have consumed a lot of speculative fiction, and I think that's that point, that the question you've made is about. I think speculative fiction is around sociological futures and different sociological aspects. And by future, I guess at that point, time. It's not necessarily, Western Gregorian time that I think needs to be the way we understand speculative fiction either. And I think science fiction is definitely still speculative fiction, but science fiction is going to focus more on technological futures and even post-human futures. But post-human futures can be sociological futures in that knowledges can continue to exist without humans. But yeah, I think that would be in my brain, the way to define speculative fiction being sociological. And the way that some people have kind of commented on the different writing in this book, and the beauty of this book, I think, is in that it explores speculative fiction through, as you said, the past, present, and future, the slipstream of that kind of idea of time, and yeah, I think people get really hung up from a Western perspective of speculative fiction, of time being linear, that it has to be a forward projection of time for it to be truly speculative. Whereas I think there's some beautiful examples in this anthology from other writers, not from myself in this particular example, funnily enough, of writing that is grounded in different methodologies of speculative fiction. In particular, Karen Wilde's piece, I think, is a beautiful example of that. Some indigenous speculative fiction can be this moment where, like, the descendants of the I like to say the descendants of the imaginary future. So it is about lineages, heritage, past, but also how the past is the future, how it meets. And I think, also, tell me if you want to ask any particular questions or if I'm going on too long. But I do have a lot to say about indigenous futurisms. And
let me ask you a question that frames that, because I have a lot of questions about indigenous futurisms. There's 4 indigenous contributors in the anthology: yourself, Karen Wilde, Claire G. Coleman, and Amberlyn Quay-Mulliner. And then, of course, there's such an amazing body of work from indigenous writers in the form of speculative fiction. Alexis Wright, Ellen Van Nieuwen, for example, are 2 of my favorite writers in the country, not just indigenous writers, but writers in the country who both work in speculative fiction. My question is, why is speculative fiction such an empowering and important and relatable form for indigenous writers, including yourself?
Yeah, I think really indigenous futurisms is a way for us to intervene into how people have studied us, written about us, or have been experts in our lives. It's an intervention into colonialisms, and it's it's also then a way for us to imagine the resurgence of our languages and knowledges and the ways of being that are indigenous in many different forms, and therefore it goes to also is always probably going to talk to a relationship or relationality to country in a future sense. And I guess that would be also another point of difference between Western speculative fiction, or like the Anthropocene narrative, which is like the spectacle of the end of the world, the environmental crisis, the apocalypse, where I think Indigenous futurisms, of course, they can imagine the apocalypse and it can imagine an environmental crisis, but I think it's framed in this sense of caring for country. I think it is not about the spectacle of me and myself and what's happening to my capitalist life now that their world has ended. It's like the story of probably the country of place and communities. So I think in a way, I guess it's telling a collective future as well, instead of an individual future, which is really beautiful.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm gonna open it up for questions in about 5 minutes. But before I do that, I want to just quickly see if Khalid's had any afterthoughts. But before that, I'll say I take your point about the violence inflicted upon Black women and trans Black communities. I would argue that the way the mainstream culture and white culture has kind of framed the debates around Black Lives Matter has been about like figures, the symbolic figure of George Floyd, for example. I wanted to ask you if you have any afterthoughts from the last time I asked you a question, and all three of you, before we go to questions, how you're all feeling. I think it's been a really intense conversation we've been having, and I want to just check in and make sure you're all feeling okay and strong before we take some questions.
I think that's a good point. I think what I was trying to get at is that less and less as time's gone on, I've become less interested in the usefulness of at least personally to me, the usefulness of that spectacle of Black violence. I don't think it's like something we should be avoiding and not be doing. I think Toni Morrison has a really good perspective on it, where she writes about how the specter of Black death or Black violence being done onto Black bodies, it's always super saturated and hyper real, and it's always a spectacle in American culture and also in Australian culture. But that should, despite that, we shouldn't lose sight of the things that we do with our stories, because these, but when we have someone like when we have people dying and then those people being almost valorized and standing in for these grand narratives about justice and liberation and dignity and the biopolitics of living under a police state and all of that. I'm interested in all of those discussions as a Black person who has a body and who is interested in maintaining the safety and health of my family members and communities and all people in general. I find it more and more hard to stomach the hyper specificity of the violence. I have stopped watching the videos years ago. When the George Floyd thing was happening in June, there was a moment in which I read about it, and then I settled a few key facts in my mind, and then I specifically never sought out more information or stopped reading about it or stopped looking into it, because it was just depleting in a way that can't be theorized. And I struggle with that, and I don't know what usefulness that is in terms of a writing life. I know it's more useful in terms of my fiction writing than my nonfiction writing, because I can sit in silence and not knowing what to say in fiction a lot easier than in nonfiction. But yeah, it's hard because I get asked these kinds of questions relatively often, and I'm always at a complete loss. I'm always in a complete panic because I don't know how to. it's, you know, it's depleting and difficult and worthwhile in terms of looking in, you know, knowing, but it's hard. It's like, I can't, stuff that I know in my gut, in my heart, and I find it difficult to be someone who's used to theorizing things and have this huge thing that I'm unable to think about.
Thank you. Michelle and Hannah, how are you feeling before I give you some questions? There's some intense ones that are coming our way.
I'm feeling pretty good. I mean, when you sort of have these big, deep, intense conversations, I always try to approach it being pretty pliable and open and just listening. So yeah, I'm going in with that same spirit for questions.
Yeah, I think all of us can feel, a bit of a sense of loss and grief when we talk about these things publicly on panels, but also, you know, I like what Michelle said around just also having the space for listening and understanding what each other is saying.
Thank you. Well, okay. Well, brace yourselves. I'm going to read out a couple of questions, and then I'm going to give you all an opportunity to answer. The first one, I'm not going to waste your time with. I'm going to answer it. It's the constant reference to white. Please explain, what do you mean by white? Such generalizations are blinkered. What I will say as an answer is, we didn't invent the word white. White people invented the word white to distinguish themselves from us. If you're interested in complex definitions of whiteness, the ones that we are using when we refer to white, I recommend you read White Nation by Ghassan Haj. He defines white in White Nation as the fantasy position of cultural dominance born out of the history of European expansion. The second question that I want to read, and this one specifically I want you to answer first, Hannah, but maybe Michelle and Khaled want to weigh in, is what do you feel white people can do to distinguish between virtue signaling and demonstrating solidarity?
I think there's a bit of kind of self-learning, unlearning that can happen, and I'm not saying that everybody is always virtue signaling. I think I'm just saying, in this kind of digital social media world that we live in, think about what you're posting, when you're the attention. There's actually some pretty good resources out there on solidarity and how to be a good ally that I don't have in my brain right at this moment. Somebody else might have some good tips and links. I think your own story and your relationality to like your family story, and how you came to live here, be here, all of those things that you unpack will lead you to some kind of way of maybe learning more about yourself, rather than projecting that outwards.
Thanks, Hannah. Khaled and Michelle, do you want to weigh in? Michelle?
I would really echo that. For me, it's about, for me, the difference between virtue signaling and actually making action happen is that, you have to actually act. It's not just about the things that you project as your own brand or image out into the world. Like, what are the things you're doing privately that doesn't get seen, that's like about your own self-education. And just like, there's so many books out there that you can read, but books like Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad, books like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. Seeking out these texts and taking it upon yourself to be the one who can do those interrogations and do that education, and feel more informed and feel more confident in your choices and how you choose to live your life.
Khaled?
I'd echo Michelle and Hannah's statements, and also add that don't expect a point where you're like, I'm a good person now, I'm not racist. It's a lifelong thing, and it's something that like isn't it isn't a balm, or it isn't something that's designed to make you feel better about yourself. It's designed to address, it's a serious moral and ethical question about the way you live your life as a white person, the way you engage with non-white people, and it's not about feeling bad.
Thank you.
If you haven't read Dark in You, maybe read that.
I agree with all your answers. I feel very compelled to add, one of the best ways that white Australians in the reading community can support Indigenous people and people of color is to buy Indigenous books written by Indigenous people and books written by people of color. And on that note, I really want to stress and emphasize, buy this book. It's utterly fantastic, and it's basically an arts degree and a cultural theory degree in one little package for you. Next question I want to ask all three of you is a question by another anonymous person who wrote, I'm interested in your insights in how you use fiction to explore the truth and the future, to explore the past. I think that's a really interesting question, especially considering our as a whole is not just a commentary on the future, but on the past and the present. Maybe I'll start with Michelle.
I think for me, fiction or any sort of literature is really a great tool for that, because when you're consuming something, whether it's literature, a TV show, a theatre show, it's a very intimate experience where the author is speaking almost directly to you. Sorry, I just missed what was the first part of the question, Mohammed?
I'm interested in your insights in how you use fiction to explore the truth and the future, to explore the past.
Yes, and I think fiction it's a really safe way in which to explore really big, unsavory ideas often. And for me personally, you don't see it so much in this piece, although I think there are elements of humour in it. But something that I do a lot in my own fiction is I use comedy as a tool. I use comedy as a tool because I find it's a lot more easy to express a difficult idea if you're able to make someone laugh and get them on your side. Sorry about that drilling, as opposed to getting up on a soapbox and ranting and getting people offside. So I have more to say, but maybe I'll just wait till this stops and let someone else speak first.
Khaled, what do you think?
As a tool for self-understanding and self-knowledge in terms of the past and I think fiction can be an interesting way to reconcile things for yourself as a writer. I also think that I don't know, like it's like I write about milieus that I'm in, so a lot of my fiction touches on things that I'm interested in and things that I'm dealing with at the time. And I often, don't so much explore these situations or personal issues or things that I'm thinking about so much as exploit them for drama. So in that sense, occasionally there can be some true insight into something I wanted to settle in my own life. But it's more about, I guess, I don't know. I guess there is a sense of universality to fiction that can speak to broader truths and histories, and there is that, but the search is often just as important too.
Hannah.
I don't know if this is going to answer that question, but the question made me think about the idea of alternative histories, which is exploring truths and often, dark truths and unsettled truths and histories that aren't recognized. So alternative histories being a futurism method where, and there's a good example of that in After Australia with Rowanna's piece, the East Australian company Mango Bridge, I hope that's the right title. So literally rewriting something that had happened to imagine an alternative future is a really nice tool.
Thanks, Hannah. Michelle, do you want to jump back in?
Yes, sorry about the noise before. So yeah, I think stories as well, and fiction, if it's done well, it has this really powerful ability to promote empathy and in a lot of ways reimagine the past and create a new future. Because, you know, there's one history that gets recorded, and that's one very particular perspective.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you all one last question. I think it's a really good question to finish on. First, I want to point out to our audience that I, as the editor, made the strategic decision not to include any editor's notes or any introduction to the anthology. I really wanted the writers and the writing to speak for itself. But I did choose to start the book for myself with an epigraph. I chose a quote from Malcolm X, who's behind me. And the quote is that the future belongs to the people who prepare for it today. And I think that this is a good question to finish on because it resonates with that epigraph that we used for the opening of our book. The question is, there was a big trend towards dystopian fictions before the pandemic. What do you think will change in the ways that writers, especially indigenous writers and writers of color, imagine the future now? So maybe we'll start with Khaled this time.
That's an interesting question. I don't like in terms of how the notion of the apocalypse will change in the future. Well, I think well, obviously, like our notions of the apocalypse reflect our notions of ourselves at the time in which we're thinking about this, and I expect that to change as time goes on. I don't really know about like trends in fiction. About 5 or 10 years ago, there was this big thing about like the next big trend in fiction and writing will be this or that, and one of them was post-apocalyptic fiction, and I wasn't really sure what to make of it at the time because I don't really see post-apocalyptic fiction or the idea of the apocalypse as existing. It exists in genre as something separate to you know, every other story. It's its own thing, but in terms of like writing in general, I don't really see a difference between writing about the most important things that are happening now and writing about what would quote unquote be about the apocalypse. Maybe that will be the trend. Maybe you'll stop being its own thing and start just being writing.
Hannah, what do you think?
I think that's a really good question. I think, you know, we're all definitely affected by what's been happening in very different ways, and kind of living in interacting like we are now, literally on Zoom, engaging with each other in a different format, and it's exhausting. I don't know how everybody else feels, particularly this way because I'm doing so many Zooms. Yeah, this idea of thinking that this year was going to be like a moment of slowing, and then actually it wasn't. I'm exhausted. I think things like that are definitely going to affect writers. And I do think, look, the epigraph is so perfect because preparedness, like when you're writing the future and whatever timeline you are using for your future, it is about preparedness. The stories are how you can exist in this world that you're creating. So I mean, I don't think lots of people are going to be writing about pandemics for a while. Or maybe they will. Maybe every single person will write about pandemic. I don't know. Omar would have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Don't forget that Omar did it first.
He did before the pandemic. Yeah, but I am interested, and so it is a really good question, but I don't know if that I have an answer, but I'm interested to see how people shift in this moment. And it is, well, actually, I do have a bit of an answer. How about but the idea of returning to a way of society being normal, so, you know, pre-coronavirus, a lot of the responses to coronavirus are like how do we get through different stages so things can go back to the way they were before? Well, I would really love it if some things didn't go back to the way they were before. So maybe lots of people will write about how things never were normal, or it was only normal for some people. How it was, many things.
It's weird because, we're talking about writing being speculative, and here we are, we've all meeting and we're talking about this work, but for a long time, the work that brought us all together was speculative. I was working in the story for a long time, and I didn't even know if it would end up somewhere, if people would read it, if it would end up in the book, so, I feel like I spent a long time writing speculatively, and now we're talking about, I think writing is deeply speculative, and I think that's why speculative fiction is such a rich vein to explore all these questions with, because it hits at the deepest part of ourselves, which is, I don't know, if you talk about from neuroscience perspective, our brains only really recognize patterns and plan for the future, and that's all, or catastrophize about the future. And those are two things our brain does. So why not more speculative fiction? Maybe it's the only fiction.
Michelle.
I'm just furiously scribbling down notes as everyone's talking and reminding me of things. But I think what the pandemic has done is really highlighted to us the many ways in which systems are broken. And what Hannah was saying before about, what was normal was actually really awful for a lot of people. And there was this poll, I think it was on one of ABC's social media platforms, where they asked, during the first lockdown, are you looking forward to going back to life as you knew it? And it was in the end, maybe 70 or 80% of people said no. So, I think that's pretty indicative that there was a lot that was wrong. And, especially this idea that busyness equates to success. And now that we've been forced to slow down, people are interrogating oh, well, that's what was not so great about my life. I think because systems were so broken beforehand, I think that's just shed light on how bad things were and how bad things have gotten in the pandemic. And I guess maybe just a small example on the practical ways that things have changed, at least, for East Asian diasporas around the world, and especially in the Western world, just instances of racism and violence against East Asians because of COVID and it's supposed, well, there's arguable data about the genesis of the virus and all of that.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to conclude now. I'm Michael Mohammed Ahmad. I am the editor of the fantastic new anthology, After Australia, which I urge all the everybody that's joined us today to check out. It's a fantastic book, and it's an incredibly important and timely book. I've been joined with 3 of the amazing contributors of the anthology today, Hannah Donnelly, Khaled Wasemi, and Michelle Law. I want to thank all 3 of you for joining us for this riveting conversation.
Thank you for hosting our conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Mohammed, and thanks so much to Hannah and Khaled as well for being amazing people to speak with.
Yeah, and also thanks to the City of Melbourne and the audience members, and for all the lovely questions as well that we've been receiving.
Thank you. I have a concluding statement, which is thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to this Knowledge Melbourne YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. There's also a link in the chat to a survey. The City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts on the event, but please spare us your white fragility. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor, and I look forward to seeing you all on the other side.